Well, welcome everybody. Um, we have a wonderful guest this evening, um, Margaret Willis, who is a historian and much more, and a gardener, and the expert on 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, and produces the most wonderful books, which one of which today we'll be going through thoroughly. It's called In the Shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral. And don't expect a book about a church. She's talking about London and the world and everything in the century, intellectual and everything. And this is the journey we're going on. We're going to go on a journey, a historical journey, which starts way back with the Anglo-Saxons and ends today, when in fact, we'll all remember St. Paul's Cathedral was being used to bury our Queen only last month. This is a thread of history which belongs to all of us, and the expert is Margaret. So I don't know where to start from that, but how can I ask a few questions first about you? I sense when I read your books, and it's well worth reading all the other ones as well. I mean, there's a real passion as well as a knowledge of around the 16th and the 17th and the 18th century. I mean, it's in your blood. You live it. I mean, how did this come about? I mean, what was it?
Well, I started as a child, I was taken to see the tombs in Westminster Abbey by my mother, who was rather startled that she didn't, because it was raining, and my godmother told her that that might be something to do. And so she took me to Westminster Abbey, and it was like a Damascene moment. I came out and I said, I want an entire list of all the kings and queens of England, which also startled her. This was just before, this was in 1952. No, 1951, and so then George VI died and Elizabeth came to the throne, and I realised that history was part of today. So that was an interesting discovery. But and I always loved Tudor history, and so when I was at university, I was looking at what special subject I should do, rather important part of the course, and I chose to do American documents because my best friend was doing it, which was one of the stupidest things imaginable. But a chance conversation with somebody told me that there was a special subject called architecture in the age of Wren, and that was absolutely bang on. I loved it. Was completely I've always loved architectural history. So very luckily, my tutor, long-suffering tutor, managed to get onto the very famous architectural historian, distinguished historian Howard Colvin, and he agreed at the last moment to put me in his course, and that changed everything.
Fantastic. And what happened then? You graduated, you went on. Did you go immediately into an academic life, or did you?
No, I've never been really an academic.
Oh, really?
I stayed on an extra year with Howard Colvin and did Tudor architecture.
Yes.
And then I managed to get a job in publishing, which was very unusual at the time. The appointments board was so surprised that they insisted on me explaining to everybody how I'd done it, which I'm not sure. Anyhow, it was an illustrated book division that I was in at Weidenfeld, and I also specialized in history books. And so I was with 3 trade publishers, very much doing history books before I became the publisher at the National Trust. And I was there I was for 20 years. So architecture and history have continued, and gardens.
And gardens, yes. Well, this was the age of gardens, as I think we will hear more when we go further down the line. It is amazing. I mean, I've read 2 of your books. One is the one we're going to discuss, but also the other one, which I read, was your book on Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn, who are such fascinating characters, and the ones who wrote about it and knew each other as friends. I mean, it was extraordinary. And through their lives, you just brought alive the whole intellectual world of then. And it's so fascinating to see with the Royal Societies and all these things about how curious everybody was about everything. And that was science. And they believed that science was something which any person could grasp the whole of in those days. And now it's just separated in systems. I mean, it's a sort of a, how did that influence you? I mean, which part of that sort of world appeals to you? Is it the architecture? Is it the gardens? Is it
That's a really difficult question.
Where's in your heart?
I found the whole thing. The way I decided to tackle it was to take a cabinet of curiosities, and I live in Hackney, and in a nearby museum, which used to be called the Jeffrey Museum and now is the Museum of the Home, they have John Evelyn's Cabinet of Curiosities, which is absolutely amazing. But it had been consigned to the basement, and because it was too posh. But I hope it's come up again, but I don't know. But that gave me the shape of how I could look at the subject, and because of course Pepys was above all, he loved music, adored music, and loved women, of course, as did Evelyn, perhaps. But also he had very much his naval career, whereas Evelyn was a horticulturalist, and as I said the one activity that Pepys reveals as his horticultural activity was burying his Parmesan cheese in the back garden of their residence as the fire of London approached. So so it was difficult. So one featured very heavily in some chapters, and the other in others. But then they balanced out in the middle, as you say, with science. They were both really interested in science.
Well, I think we're going to be talking about that when it comes to St. Paul's, which perhaps we might start looking at, because this is really as a Magnus Opus, and it's perhaps you can let's see the first slide, Ben. Thanks. Now, what is that? I mean,
this is a recreation done in the early 20th century of London viewed from the west, looking eastwards, and St. Paul's Cathedral dominates on the left-hand side, that soaring spire, and it's very much what London would have looked like in the 14th century.
It's incredible. It's difficult to imagine that one doesn't think of London as being such a beautiful grand city as that. and the steeple was it the tallest in England? I mean, it was I remember
well, that's interesting. I wonder if Salisbury would claim that theirs was higher. I haven't actually compared. It was well over 200 feet. Wren said it was 260 feet. Hook, his science friend, reckoned it was 200 feet, but it was huge. But what we've got to also remember is that the cathedral, which was a Norman structure, which was built in the reign of William II, William Rufus, that is set up high on a hill, Ludgate Hill. You've got Ludgate. You can see Ludgate halfway down. It's the gate of the city, and behind it is the gate of St. Paul's Cathedral, little city called Paulsbury, a city within a city. So it's set up high above London, and would have been absolutely kind of dominated the whole of London.
Yes. Was it considered the sort of centre of London from the beginning? Was it the Church of London from the very beginning?
Well, it was the Church of London, of course, because it was the Church of the Bishops of London, and it was only politically the political oddity of the Anglo-Saxons that the Archbishop was based in Canterbury, but it actually so people referred to it. I was rather fascinated when I was reading accounts that people talked about it as pools or old pools, as if it was like an old sock that they lived, that dominated them, you know. Whereas, and actually, they often had greater loyalty to their own parish churches, of which there were many, 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 as you can see some of them there.
One can see them around, can't one?
Yes, and so sometimes it could cause trouble when the cathedral was badly in need of funds. They had the crown and the government had difficulty getting people to contribute because their loyalty was to their own church. So it was sort of something they lived with over the centuries.
So it was begun with Saxon churches, which burnt down, I think you told me, and this was sort of fourth attempt.
Yes.
After William's chancellor had built a bigger one, and that burnt down.
No. This is the one that this is number 4 is the one.
This is the one that survived.
Yes.
And then William Rufus, sort of who followed on from William I, made it into the grand status. Well, would that be right? I mean,
the Chancellor Morris, who had been Chancellor to William the Conqueror, he was the Bishop of London under William Rufus. So he built it with Rufus's. Everybody's very rude about William Rufus, but he encouraged the building of it. So
yes,
and it was bigger. It was bigger than the subsequent one, Rennes Cathedral.
Really?
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I mean, that is fantastic. I mean, it almost from the very beginning, I think you told me it started being a hub for people in London as well. I mean, didn't you say that all the fruiterers and all the sort of the food stores and things started gathering around the cathedral because that's where people went.
That's right, yeah. And so they'd come up from Fish Street. There would be a fish market and there would be a vegetable market, and the Dean and Chapter got very fed up with all of this and kept on telling them to pushing the markets further away. So the meat market went to Newgate, just north. Yeah.
It brings us on to something which I seem to know. It seemed to be, of course, the church is religious, and there was a religious element, and they talked about religious things and had sermons, but it was also for the people. And from the very beginning, it was a place of gathering. Would that be right? I mean, the moots of London met there formally, I think, whatever a moot was.
Yes, the moot, which was an Anglo-Saxon institution, met just outside the actual cathedral walls because it was very much the civic government of London, and it met 3 times a year. The citizens of London, who they exactly were is a moot point. They gathered to sort of sort out things like defence of the city, making sure there weren't fires in the heat of the summer and that kind of thing. But this sort of, it was called the folk moot, and the folk memory of it really translated when later on, or as it was coming to an end, St. Paul's Cross was erected.
Ah,
yeah.
Yes. Hey, what's happened to the steeple?
Well, the steeple got so this painting was painted in 1616. At the time of James I, and you can just see James I in the gallery above the Lord Mayor, etc. And he the steeple was struck by lightning during the reign of his predecessor Elizabeth I in 1561. Mm-hmm. And despite efforts on her part, which I mentioned earlier, to try and get people to repair it, get money to repair it, and she gave quite a lot of money, and she was not well known for doing that. And James also tried very hard to do the same. In fact, this painting was painted by somebody for somebody who was lobbying in order to try and get money to make it look beautiful again. So it's rather a fascinating painting, but it also shows St. Paul's Cross which is in a little pulpit, with domed pulpit on the left-hand bottom side, bottom of the picture. So the preacher is preaching to a crowd while there's a man whipping the dog because it's causing a disturbance. And as I said, James I is there with his Queen and his Prince of Wales and the Lord Mayor and his alderman. But fascinating as well, this painting is such a valuable painting for us. That those are two little sort of between the buttresses on the right-hand side are shops which had been built against the walls of the cathedral, and they are probably booksellers, bookshops, and they've got chimneys belching away smoke into the chancel of the cathedral. Or is it? Yes, no, it's a transept of the cathedral. I always get it slightly skew with.
I got the impression reading that very little happened inside the cathedral, and all the great meetings and the sermons and everything took place outdoors. Why was that?
Well, it's partly space, and in the Middle Ages. So it was really for all the citizens of London to come to there were literally thousands of people attended these outdoor sermons, and in fact the preachers must have had the greatest difficulty projecting their voices, and they preached for an hour, 2 hours. They were provided. A Swiss traveller explains that they were provided with wine and bread in that pulpit to keep them going. But also within the church itself, there was a huge screen across, a stone screen, and very much sort of the divine services went on behind that screen in the chancel and the choir and the chancel, at this time. When this picture was painted, the middle aisle, which is what they call the nave, had become very much a secular space with a road going straight through the middle from north to south. And so people trundling through with their mules and their pack horses and carts, and prostitutes and for hire, and servants for hire, and gallants walking up and down showing off their costumes. So it was very kind, and news being exchanged, very important.
A sort of community centre in a way. I mean,
absolutely, yes. Yeah. Well, I call it a churchyard within a churchyard, you know.
Yes. Wow. I mean, and looking back, the things which were discussed there have an amazing resonance on history. I mean, I think you told me that Wycliffe and his Lollards this was where the debate, I mean, the big religious debate of the time, this starting in the 15th century, 16th century, started the religious debates, which went on right up to the Civil War, and this was one of the grounds where the arguments were made. Yeah. Would that be right? Or?
Absolutely, although it started even earlier, because Wycliffe is right at the end of the 14th century.
14th century, yeah.
So his followers nailed notices to the west doors of the cathedral, rather like Luther's supporters at Wittenberg, sort of declaring, that there should be a Bible in English, and that the church should be reformed.
And who was Wycliffe? What was he? What was he challenging?
Well, he was an Oxford theologian, and what he was challenging was what he felt was the corruption of the church, especially simony and indulgences, sale of indulgences. He was also supportive of the idea of the scriptures being in English, which they had been available in English during Anglo-Saxon times, and it was the Normans who'd put an end to that. But and the church was desperate. In the Middle Ages, was so against the idea of things being of the scriptures being, cast before, like pearls before swine, that this was something they absolutely hated the idea of the English Bibles. He also, of course, it was very much one of his things was to do with sorry, I can't think what the word is, to do with what happens at the Mass, the communion, about the body of Christ. But the Bibles, so Bibles were actually written in hand in the area to the north of the cathedral, by the scriveners who were there, who produced missals and these covered Bibles, which are extraordinary. I saw one the other day. They're tiny because they had to hide them, because they were, again, they were very much, people found with them, they would be declared heretics. But this was the community of the book community of just north of the cathedral. So, yes.
And there we get on to books.
We do get on to books. So we had this community to the north, who were all craftsmen working by hand. So they would produce the paper, the parchment. They were scriveners. They were illuminators. They were bookbinders. But then in 1476, William Caxton when he came back to England, he brought with him a printing press from the Low Countries, and he set up this printing press in Westminster Abbey, and started printing books, because he realised that the court and the church would be his patrons. He died, and his success and his business was inherited by his assistant, who had the wonderful name of Wynkyn de Worde, the Dutchman. And Wynkyn de Worde moved the printing press from Westminster Abbey to Fleet Street, reckoning that this is around the year 1500. Reckoning that the future of the book really lay with the merchants of the city, and of course the churchmen of the city as well, so that he would be close to both of those. And that this is his imprint, and you can see he's taken Caxton's initials. He's got himself underneath, Wynkyn de Worde, and then at the top he's got the sun, because his shop was at the sign of the sun in Fleet Street. And he linked up with those craftsmen that I mentioned earlier, and the craftsmen had created themselves into a mystery, which is actually it's a mastery, yes, like mystery plays, a trade guild of stationers. And the reason why they were called stationers is because they had stalls or stations set up in St Paul's churchyard. Why it should be applied to them rather than anybody else, a greengrocer or anything with his stall, I don't know, but they are called stationers, and they've been stationers ever since. And Mary Tudor gave them a royal charter in 1556 and they then had they had all the privileges and monopoly of printing and bookselling in the city, and music.
So the churchyard became not only a place for debate, but also a place where one could buy books and read about it.
Absolutely.
And so was this is getting to be a very intellectual center. I mean, was this where did people would presumably go to find the latest book and stuff?
Absolutely, yes. And very much sort of things like the sermons, of course, were printed. Yeah. So the pulpit and press are interlinked. So there are a lot of sermons, but then gradually the range got greater, and people like Shakespeare would have gone he went to the churchyard to get his sources for his plays, because the range was extending, the English language was extending.
And he found all the Italian stories there. I mean,
exactly, Plutarch, yes.
Plutarch and all the others. Amazing. And it's a sort of, but also, was it just it wasn't just religious books, it was all sorts of books. But I mean, I imagine that a lot of the books, I mean, in a way now, I mean, most of the books are about cooking and gardening far more than literature and stuff. I mean, was it the same then? I mean, they had all these almanacs and things. Would they be making the almanacs, and would that be part of the main trade as well? I mean, so people
Incredibly
from
important, yes.
all sources. It's not just the sort of the professors who went, it was also the people who wanted to. So I mean, this place was becoming it's becoming a community.
It's a hub.
A
And
hub,
yes, and
yeah.
yeah, so not the proportion of books would have been overwhelmingly religious until right through the 16th century. But it's interesting you bring up almanacs, because that was one of the monopolies that the stationers had, was the production of almanacs. They had to produce one every year, of course, and it was part of what they called English stock. And these were really important they were very valuable, and they held on to that privilege until the late 18th century. And they stored them in their warehouse at Stationers' Hall. So yes, almanacs are very important, because they were needed by people to be able to tell about, well, it's a diary, but it also all kinds of information was given in them, including things like cookery recipes and recipes, some of the disgusting recipes for medicine cures. So they were very, yes, it's interesting that you brought that up, but yes.
Well, I was just thinking, this wasn't a place for this. This was the place for all society to go.
Well, absolutely, yes,
Yeah.
everybody, yes,
Yeah.
yes, the great and the good and the not so good.
And,
So,
and they wanted to be entertained, I gather. Who is that?
this is Moll Cutpurse, and she was a well-known thief, and she and you could see that she liked dressing up in men's clothes. So she was actually arrested for going into what I called earlier the middle aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral, dressed in men's costume, and that was just too much. So she was arrested at Christmas, and so she was arrested and and did penance by the cross in St. Paul's churchyard. The person who was preaching at the time was rather hopeless, according to local to reports, and she was drunk. But while the people were all staring open-mouthed at her, their purses were being cut by her friends. And she's immortalized by Ben Jonson and other Jacobean dramatists as the Roaring Girl.
The Roaring Girl. Wow. And we were discussing, was she acted by a girl or a boy?
It would have to been a boy, and of course
It would have been a boy, yeah.
it had fine calves, obviously.
But I mean, this is theatre now, and apart from religious debate of the highest order and everything else, this also became a theatre. Is that right?
There was a theatre in 1600 of a boys' company, which was held they were boys from the choir school, and about 12 or 14 of them, and they had put on performances in the almoner's house to the south of the cathedral, and people could go and pay to go and see them, and they were great draw. So those gallants who were sort of marching up and down in the middle aisle of the cathedral would then be able to pay sixpence to go and watch a play. And the plays that were put on by the boys were written by major playwrights, not Shakespeare. He didn't approve of these boy actors. Ben Jonson wrote plays for them, and particularly John Marston, and very sophisticated plays. One of the plays that he put on it wrote for them was called The Dutch Courtesan. And so they were and I have seen a performance of it done by the boys of King Edward's School in Stratford-on-Avon, and it was so brilliant. The boy who played the courtesan was very, very affecting. It was absolutely brilliant.
Gosh. And also, and again, these wouldn't have been religious plays as such. I mean, they'd have been plays about life. I mean, the same sorts of things as happening in the Globe and all the other theatres at the time.
That's right. There was also a boys' company in Blackfriars as well, which Ben Jonson very much wrote for. They are secular plays, and Shakespeare mentions the boy actors and in his Hamlet, and how in the play Hamlet, and he didn't really, he thought there shouldn't be just an exclusive boys' company. They should be apprenticed to the actors and be trained by them.
So in this church, basically everything else, everything secular was happening in that courtyard outside the church.
Yeah.
It's fantastic, and that lasted until the Civil War, possibly. I mean,
until the Great Fire. Until the Great Fire, it still went on. Yes,
it still went on, even through Cromwell's time.
Well, Cromwell's time, the church really deteriorated. The cathedral, it was used as a stables for the army. A foal was baptized in the font, and in fact, the cathedral was threatened. I mean, the Commonwealth were thinking of abolishing all the cathedrals.
Goodness, yeah. So thank you for the restoration. With the restoration came science, which of course started in Elizabethan times with Francis Bacon and others, but London became the thing, and it was very much here as well. What is that?
This charming creature is a louse, and he comes from a book that Robert Hooke, who I mentioned earlier, who is a great scientist. He was at Gresham. He was the Gresham College. He was the curator of experiments, and he wrote this wonderful book called Micrographia, in which he described what you could see through a microscope. And he himself was a very good illustrator, so he actually drew the pictures to be engraved. And this is the louse. And Samuel Pepys went and bought a copy of Micrographia from his bookseller. He was in the churchyard, and he was very excited by it. He thought it was wonderful, and he sat up all night looking at it. And then he tried to make a microscope work himself, and he couldn't get it to work because you needed a light source to help you. Anyhow, he was sorted out, and then he was as happy as Larry. But he knew Hooke. Hooke was very much part of the Royal Society, as was Pepys and Evelyn and Christopher Wren.
So we've actually now skipped the Civil War. We're now into King Charles II's time, and that really was the time when science became not just hobbies of the elect, but it became part of life and stuff, and they were sanctioned. Tell us about the Royal Society, and did they have a link with St. Paul's Churchyard as well?
They did, in a way. So the Royal Society was founded by Charles II in 1662 for very much sort of the dissemination of knowledge, and fellows of the society gathered regularly to hear papers, to see experiments put on largely by Robert Hooke, go off all over the place to do things like a diver was lowered into the Thames, see how long he could stay underwater. They looked at all kinds of experiments with automaton. But their connection with the churchyard really is that James Allistry and John Martin were two booksellers who were given permission to. They had the privilege of publishing the the books that are written by the members of the Royal Society. So Hooke's book was published in 1664 or 65, I can't quite remember. And then there was also Evelyn's book about trees and silver, which is a terribly important book as well. So they published those books in St. Paul's Churchyard.
And presumably too, would there be translations of what was being discovered in Europe and stuff being sold there as well? Would it be would the book place be part of the general scientific?
That's an interesting point, because of course the Dutch were very, very kind of they were really pioneers of all kinds of things, Huygens and people like that. So they would have translated papers. Although the Dutch, what's so fascinating about the Royal Society is that the transactions, which are philosophical transactions, which are still being published today, they were published in English. But they went all over Europe. So suddenly the English language, having been was leading the way for once, instead of being very much, you know, tail end Charlie earlier in book history. So yes, it was very much English that was leading the and there were fellows of the Royal Society in America, in the colonies, and also overseas ones from Holland, and so it was an international society.
Fantastic, fantastic. But it all came rather to an end shortly after that. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, indeed. So this is September 1666, when the Great Fire of London broke out. And it broke out in a baker's shop just to the north of London Bridge. So you can see the flames on the right-hand side in this woodcut, just where it started. But it unfortunately, and of course there were fires going on the whole time in London. It was one of the great plagues of London. But this was an exceptionally strong winds. They said they were blowing from Holland, with whom we were at war at the time, and so the flames sort of pushed the fire to the winds pushed the fire westwards, and then it eventually got to St. Paul's Cathedral, which you can see on the left-hand side, and that was regarded as a real catastrophe. And the stationers had put their papers and their stock and their almanacs, etc., in their hall, but also in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, which was their own church, which had been subsumed earlier at St. Faith's. So they put them all there, and unfortunately there was wooden timbers up holding up the the tower, the central tower, because of this dilapidation, which I mentioned earlier, and the failure to be able to pay for it to be properly repaired. And so the flames went straight up the timber scaffolding, along the roof, melted the lead, and the whole thing went up like a bonfire. And so strong were the winds that some of the half-burned leaves of the books were found in Windsor.
Oh.
But when the winds dropped, then so they got the fire under control. So it was 5 days really. The evening of 6th of September was when Pepys and Evelyn both described walking around the city in horror at what they were seeing.
Oh, so this was just after Pepys had buried his cheese. Did he get his cheese back after the fire?
Yes, he did, because lucky Pepys, the naval residences were in Seething Lane, which were to the east of London Bridge, and the flames didn't quite make it there. The Duke of York, who was Lord High Admiral, Charles's brother, he blew up some of the streets to create a fire break.
what a tragedy. I mean, but life went on, didn't it? And so,
It did indeed.
I mean, how was it that in 300 years they weren't able to make a steeple, and in less than 100 they made this wonderful thing which we see today? Can we see it now?
Yes, so here it is. So this is Rennes Cathedral. So immediately after the fire, both he and John Evelyn both produced plans for rebuilding London, and got them in record time. Evelyn got his to the king within days, but found that he'd been pipped to the post by Wren even faster. They really wanted to rebuild London so it was very elegant and had piazzas and was not haphazard. I mean, Evelyn hated the haphazardness of it, and so they would have liked the cathedral, the churchyard, to have been like a piazza with carefully designed shops and buildings around it as a fitting centre for the cathedral. But pragmatism reared its head because, as I mentioned earlier, we were at war not only with Holland but also with France. We'd just been through the Great Plague, and they needed to get back into business again as quickly as possible. Growth, as we hear, is the very important thing today. Growth, it was get the economy going again. So both Evelyn and Wren's plans for the churchyard were never came to fruition. Because they rebuilt the houses on the place where they had been before remarkably fast. So James Allistry, who I mentioned earlier, who was a bookseller for the Royal Society publications, he was back in the churchyard with a shop and a house when he died in 1670. That's 4 years later, and an inventory was made.
How long did it take for the whole thing to be completed?
Well, I think that's interesting, and I'm not sure I would know, but I would have said that the surrounding buildings were all up and being used in by the 1680s, because this was a prestige area, and people wanted to be back here as fast as possible. But Wren, of course, was given the task of rebuilding the cathedral, and he went through a whole series of designs because the church, the commission overseeing this had a lot of churchmen in it who were worried about processions and not making it too Roman Catholic in appearance, and very important to have preaching. Protestant preaching, very important. And so he went through all these paces with these churchmen who must have infuriated him. They kept on turning down his designs. Finally, the warrant design was created, which had a long processional. It had the cruciform with a long procession, which they wanted, and it had a very strange dome over the crossing, but they like the plan. So Charles II said, right, that's fine. I'll give it the warrant, and you can change it. You can change some details if you want to Wren, and that was his message to Wren was go ahead and get on with it, and so Wren got on with it, and he rather his interpretation is a bit loose because the dome which we see now, which is fantastic, the Great Dome, that was nothing like the dome that was originally intended. But so he got on with it. But first of all he had to demolish the massive Norman ruins, the ruins of the Norman Cathedral, and that took it forever with sort of explosions. And so one bookseller was busy in there. I think the proofreaders upstairs in their shop, when sort of a huge amount of stones came through the window because Woodruff, who was Wren's assistant had used too strong an explosion and dynamite.
But all ended very well, and the community came back again. I mean, I think that this was the age of the literary thing and the coffee houses.
That's absolutely right. Yes.
Next thing, and this is one of them.
This is one of them. This is the coffee houses were places very much social sort of centres. This picture actually shows an altercation going on in a coffee house. It's called you can see the lady presiding at the back with the coffee over the fire, and they're actually having an argument. Somebody's just throwing coffee, if you can see, coffee at somebody else, and that's because they were this actually is a record of a terrible row that went on right at the beginning of the 18th century over a man called Dr. Cheverel, who preached a sermon, a gunpowder a sermon he was preaching it in St. Paul's Cathedral, so the cross was now no more, but the gunpowder sermons had started at St. Paul's Cross outside, but after the Great Fire and the new cathedral, the sermons went inside, but it was the same effect, that everybody knew what was going on and everybody knew that these sermons were being preached. And the gunpowder was obviously to do with the attempt by the Roman Catholics, allegedly, to blow up the Houses of Parliament with the king and all his government inside. And so from the following year, a sermon was always preached on the day on the 5th of November or the Sunday near it, very much anti-Roman, anti-Catholic. But by a wonderful coincidence, William III landed at Torbay on the 5th of November in 1688, sorry, and started the Glorious Revolution, i.e. pushing James II, James Duke of York, James II out, and he and his wife Mary becoming Protestant King and Queen of England. So 5th of November was a very important, redolent anniversary, and Sir Cheverel was chosen to give this sermon I can't quite remember, was it 1710, I think, and but he suddenly launched an attack, not so much on Roman Catholics as on what he called the sectarians, so very much the sort of non-conformists. And he was incredibly rude and illiberal, and he caused a major upset. He got his sermons printed, and thousands of them were circulated, and arguments went on in coffee houses.
So I mean, we're right back to the churchyard, but it's in coffee houses now.
Exactly.
That the whole politics are going. I mean, you directed me to a wonderful thing about Boswell writing about the apple puffs and the porter and the beer he's been having at 8p a head in one of these things, and then he says, then the conversation became political. He said, I saw that, as it seems to be agreed, that the members of Parliament became corrupted. It was better to choose men already bad, so as to save the good men.
The club was known as the Club of Honest Whigs. Yes, yes.
Honest Whigs. I think we'll leave them there and go on, because we're running a bit out of time.
Right,
I mean,
okay.
But I mean, this is the fascinating thing. It was the intellect and everything. And then high fashion. Tell me about that. How did that start?
Well, so actually, you think of it where the churchyard is. It's right next to Cheapside, which is where all the silk mercers and the goldsmiths, etc., lived and worked. And it spilt early on into the churchyard. So Pepys went shopping, not only for his books, but also for clothes for himself and his wife, and for furnishings for their house. This route came through from Cheapside round the south of the churchyard into Ludgate Hill and down to Fleet Street. And so it became absolutely the heart of London. It was the high-end shopping. It was Oxford Street and Knightsbridge rolled into one. And this is a trade card of a draper's. Very interestingly, it says Benjamin Cole, but it was actually run by his wife, but she wasn't allowed to run it by the law of curvature. So he was in fact an engraver, so he engraved this for her. And you can see that these very well-dressed ladies are showing other very well-dressed ladies pieces of lace, etc. And one of the great features of the churchyard shops was how well-dressed the shop assistants were. Fanny Burney describes how she went shopping, you know, the novelist, and her aunt had a shop, a band shop in the churchyard, and she remarked about how they were so knowledgeable about all the laces, including the male assistants. It was very funny.
Fantastic. And that went on up to the 1940s. I mean, this was the centre of London. It always had been, so almost 1,000 years. What ended it?
Well, as you say, it was dominated by the book trade, which was in Paternoster Row by this time, pushed back, and by these huge drapery emporia, which were like, you know, Liberties, etc. And then suddenly on the 29th of December, 1940, a devastating bombing raid. Completely, they rained bombs down onto St Paul's Churchyard.
Let's have the last slide. Can we have the last slide?
Yes.
Yeah, there we go.
So there we can see what happened. That obviously there's the cathedral. In front of it is the chapter house that Wren built, which had very badly damaged, as you can see here, but did survive. The other things that survived were the Stationers' Hall and some houses belonging to the canons just behind. But everything else just absolutely went. I mean, Paternoster Row, which was the centre of the book trade, lost these huge number of publishers. And again, of course, it was made worse by the fact that they were storing paper in their warehouses and in their basements. And so, just as what happened with the Great Fire, all this made it even worse, and was described as the crematorium of the book world.
And that was sort of, and that brings us more or less up to date. Let's get back now and see, I think there are some comments and questions here. Let me find.
Actually, I don't think there are many, are there?
No, I mean,
stunned.
No, stunned, no questions. Sorry, I hadn't looked. But I mean, it's, what an amazing thing. I mean, it's a sort of, what do you think how would you call St Paul's now? Is it just, it still is there, it still is the symbol, the big weddings, the big funerals as we had last week was there. I mean, but there's no equivalent, is there, of such an intellectual, such a sort of venal, such everything happened at St Paul's.
No, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I've just been thinking about it because the architectural integrity went completely. So and so it hasn't got any feeling around it at all, except it's called to the churchyard. And I've been on the bus and people have said, why is it called the churchyard? You know. So the publishers all decamped to Bloomsbury, and Doctors' Commons went, which was a law, which was the civil law part. So people say that, and so I suppose we replaced it with the University of London with its various colleges, but they're all very widely scattered. There's nothing like it today, I must say.
Well, it's a shame. I'm going to sort of, if you could hold on for a minute, I'm now just going to to let the audience know what's coming up next, and then we'll have a final couple of words before the end. We've hold on a minute, let me find the. I'm sorry, I don't normally do this. I'm standing in for Lucinda, who sadly has a family bereavement today. But let me find out what's happening next. It's tomorrow. Lucinda will be back, and she'll be talking with Richard Hammond, who is not the Top Gear man, but he's the Green Traveller, and he's done a wonderful book about traveling around Britain and other places but keeping to the green side, to the country as it should be. Next Thursday, Humphrey will be talking to Robert Sawyer, and after that with Jake Needham. I'm sorry, I don't have information right here, but and then I think, excuse me, I've not mugged up on this. We'll put this onto the, we'll put a notice out as to what's happening. And we have a few more minutes. And what do you, just in time, I think, to ask Margaret, what are you going to do next?
Well, extraordinarily, during lockdown, I was asked, I was sort of at a bit of a spare end because the book was more or less finished and at the publishers. I was approached by Southwark Cathedral, and they said they would like to do something about what the Dean called the ghosts of Southwark, which was about the people connected with the cathedral. And I was very intrigued by this and started looking at it. I have to confess, I didn't know very much about Southwark, except it was over the river. But I became completely fascinated by it. It is London's other Anglican cathedral, and it couldn't be more different from St. Paul's. So very interesting to be able to contrast the two. But it's got such a fascinating history of its own. It's got connections with Shakespeare, Chaucer, Dickens, and the church is incredibly old. I mean, it obviously did not get burnt down in the Great Fire. It was the medieval priory church, which got turned into a parish church and then got turned into a cathedral in 1905. And it's a very fascinating community. Great, lot of. It's always been quite a poor community, and it's also been very much a radical community. And so John Harvard was brought up there and went over to America and founded Harvard University. So the book looks at the theme almost of liberty. So it's an interesting contrast, and I'm enjoying it.
Absolute opposite, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, we wish you every good luck with that, and when you've done it, come back and tell us about it.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
And I found that very enjoyable, very fascinating, and I think we could have gone on and on and on. We've missed so many stories, but the ones you brought out were wonderful. So thank you very much indeed. And I think that is the end. Goodbye, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll meet again soon. Goodbye.